There are people in history who shouldn't exist, not because their stories are unbelievable, but because there is no record of where they came from. No birth, no origin, no past. They appear suddenly documented, witnessed, standing in moments that should have defined them. And yet, nothing does. No records that lead backward. No traceable identity. No clear explanation of how they arrived there at all. Some carried documents that could not be verified. Passports stamped and issued from countries that do not exist. Others appeared with no understanding of the world around them, unable to explain who they were or how they had come to be there. Some spoke of places that could not be found on any map. Others left behind fragments, small details that hinted at something larger, but never enough to form a complete picture. And in every case, the same pattern begins to emerge. They are seen, they are questioned, they are documented, and then they are gone. No resolution, no clear conclusion, just a record that something happened, and no explanation for why. Because if even one of these accounts is real, then it suggests something far more unsettling than a simple mystery. It suggests that, from time to time, people can appear without ever belonging to the world they've entered. And once you begin to look at these cases side by side, it becomes harder to treat them as isolated incidents. Instead, they begin to look like pieces of something larger, a pattern, repeating across time, across locations, across entirely different lives. And in every instance, the same question remains. Who were they? There are moments in history where someone appears with no past. In the mid-20th century, a man arrived at an airport in Japan. Nothing about him, at first, seemed unusual. He was well dressed, calm, composed, a traveler, like any other. He approached immigration, presented his documents, and waited. But when the officer opened his passport, something didn't make sense. The country listed did not exist. According to the man, he was from a place called Taured. He spoke with confidence. There was no hesitation, no confusion. To him, Taured was real. He insisted it had always been there. A country located in Europe. When asked to clarify, he pointed to a map. His finger landed on the region we now know as Andorra. But when the officer explained that no such country as Taured existed, the man became visibly unsettled, confused, then frustrated. He claimed he had travelled from Taured many times before. He had business records, documents, proof of previous visits. And yet, none of it matched any known country. His passport appeared authentic, stamped, worn, used. It showed a history of travel, entries and exits that seemed entirely legitimate, but every reference to his origin led back to a place no one could find. Officials began asking more questions. Where exactly was Taured? What language did they speak? What government issued his passport? Each answer only deepened the confusion, because nothing he said aligned with reality. The man grew increasingly distressed, not because he was being accused, but because he believed something was wrong with them. From his perspective, Taured had always existed, and the idea that no one had heard of it made no sense at all. He was detained, taken aside, held for further questioning. Authorities checked his documents. They searched for records, cross-referenced names, looked for any trace of his country. But there was nothing. No Taured, no registry, no evidence that such a place had ever existed. And yet, the man stood there, holding a passport that said otherwise. To avoid further complications, he was placed in a nearby hotel, under supervision, a temporary solution, a place to hold him, while authorities tried to understand what they were dealing with. The room was secured. Guards were positioned. He was told to remain inside. By all accounts, there was no way out. And then, by the following morning, he was gone. No sign of forced entry. No broken windows. No indication of how he had left. His belongings remained, but the man himself had disappeared, as if he had never been there at all. No further record of him was ever found. No identity confirmed. No explanation provided. The case simply ended. There have been attempts to explain the story. Some suggest the man may have been from Andorra, a small European country, misidentified through language or translation. Others believe it was a simple case of fraud, a forged passport, a traveller trying to enter under a false identity. And there are those who argue the entire account was never real to begin with. A story introduced decades later and repeated until it became accepted as fact. But each explanation has the same problem. None of them can be verified. No records, no confirmed identity, no definitive answer. And that leaves the case exactly where it began. A man standing at an airport with a passport from a place that doesn't exist, and no clear explanation for who he really was. He arrived carrying only a letter, not luggage, not identification, not any clear explanation of who he was or where he had come from. Just a letter, and in that letter was the first clue that something about this case was deeply wrong. In the spring of 1828, in the German city of Nuremberg, a teenage boy appeared in the streets alone. He looked disoriented, unsteady, as if the world around him was unfamiliar. He could barely speak, and when he did, his words were limited, repetitive, almost childlike. He seemed to know only a few phrases. One of them was a strange, insistent sentence that he wanted to be a cavalryman, like his father had been. To the people who first encountered him, he was not just lost. He was out of place. He was carrying two letters. One was addressed to a cavalry captain. The other claimed the boy had been left in someone's care as an infant and had been raised in isolation until the day he was sent away. Even then, the story felt uncertain. The handwriting was suspicious. The wording awkward, as if the letters had been created not to explain the boy, but to manage the questions that would follow him. And there were many, because the boy himself could give almost no account of his life. He said he had spent his entire existence in a small dark room, alone, with no contact with the outside world. He claimed he had never seen another face, never learned where he was, never walked freely. Food had been left for him. Water, too. And sometimes, when he awoke, his hair or nails had been cut, but he never saw who had done it. He never saw who kept him there. He described a life that barely resembled human existence. No language, no family, no identity. Only confinement. When he was brought into public view, doctors, officials, and curious onlookers all noticed the same thing. Kaspar Hauser, as he came to be known, behaved like someone who had not been formed by the world in the usual way. He struggled with light, struggled with sound. His body seemed unusually weak. His senses, strangely uneven. Some things overwhelmed him. Other things fascinated him with almost childlike intensity. He could draw. He could learn. But everything seemed delayed, distorted, or incomplete. It was as if he had arrived in society years after he should have. A person physically present, but with no normal path behind him. As news of the boy spread, so did speculation, and very quickly, the case split into two competing possibilities. The first was tragic, that Kaspar Hauser was exactly what he claimed to be, a child hidden away for years, deprived of human contact, then suddenly abandoned in the world. A real victim, a living experiment in isolation, a human life, interrupted before it had properly begun. But there was another theory, one far more dangerous, that Kaspar was not just a victim, but a threat, a missing piece in a political story that powerful people wanted buried. Because in the years that followed, whispers began to grow around one extraordinary possibility, that Kaspar Hauser was of noble blood, perhaps even royal. According to this theory, he was the true heir to the Grand Duchy of Baden, a child who had been removed, hidden, and replaced so that power could pass elsewhere. If that were true, then Kaspar was not merely a mystery. He was a problem, a surviving claim, a living contradiction, the kind of person who could destabilize titles, fortunes, entire family lines. And suddenly, the question of who he was became much larger than personal identity. It became political. It became dangerous. What made the theory so powerful was not that it could be proven cleanly, but that it refused to disappear. There were inconsistencies in the official histories, rumors in aristocratic circles, and always, hanging over the case, the feeling that Kaspar Hauser did not belong where he had appeared. Not as a peasant, not as a common runaway, not as an ordinary orphan. Something about him felt displaced, not just socially, but historically. And then the violence began. In 1829, Kaspar claimed he was attacked by a hooded man. The injury was real. The attacker was never found. Some believed the assault proved that someone wanted him silenced. Others believed Kaspar had staged it himself to gain attention. That divide would follow him for the rest of his life. Was he hunted? Or was he performing? Was he a hidden prince? Or a deeply damaged fabricator? The uncertainty only deepened. Years later, in 1833, Kaspar was stabbed again. This time, the wound would kill him. He claimed he had been lured into a garden and attacked by a stranger. But as before, there were doubts. Some believed he had accidentally wounded himself. Others believed he had once again been deliberately targeted. And just like the rest of his story, the truth refused to settle. He died without a confirmed identity, without a clear past, without resolution. And what remained behind was not one mystery, but several layered on top of each other. Who was he? Where had he really come from? Was he hidden? Was he lying? Was he a victim of confinement or the center of a political deception no one wanted exposed? Even now, Nearly 2 centuries later, Kaspar Hauser remains one of history's strangest unresolved figures. Not because the case is full of supernatural elements, not because it requires impossible explanations, but because it presents something almost as unsettling: a real person, seen by many, documented in detail, and yet never fully explained. Unlike the man from Taured, Kaspar Hauser was unquestionably real. He existed. He was observed, studied, written about, which makes his case, in some ways, even more disturbing. Because with Taured, one can always retreat into doubt. The story may be exaggerated. The records may be thin. The event itself may be legend. But Kaspar Hauser stood in front of the world. And still, no one could say with certainty who he was. That is what connects his case to the others. Not that the details are identical. They aren't. But the shape of the mystery is familiar. A person appears. The world tries to place them and fails. The records don't align. The story doesn't fit. And instead of becoming clearer with time, the figure only grows stranger. Because once again, history presents us with someone who was undeniably there, but somehow arrived without a past anyone could trust. And once again, the question remains: who was Kaspar Hauser really? They were first noticed at the edge of a field, not in a city, not at a port, not in the middle of some public disturbance, but near the village of Woolpit in rural England. 2 children, alone, silent, and immediately visibly different. Their clothing was unfamiliar. Their behavior was strange. And their skin, according to the earliest accounts, had a distinct green hue. It was that detail, more than any other, that fixed them in memory. Not just lost children, not simply foreign, but children who seemed, at first glance, not to belong to the world around them at all. The story is usually placed in the 12th century, a period of rural life, hard labor, and deeply superstitious thinking, the kind of world in which anything unfamiliar could quickly become legend. And yet, the reports of the green children of Woolpit did not survive only as whispers. They were written down, recorded by medieval chroniclers, not as jokes, not as fables in the usual sense, but as unusual events, worth preserving. According to the accounts, the children were discovered near the wolf pits from which the village took its name. They were frightened, confused, unable to explain themselves in any language the villagers could understand. The boy and the girl appeared to be related, likely brother and sister. Both resisted normal food. They would not eat bread, would not touch meat, would not accept what was given to them. Instead, they became excited only when they found raw, broad beans. That was what they ate. Nothing else. It was another detail that made the story linger, because it gave the children a strange kind of physical reality. Not symbols, not spirits, not vague apparitions. They were hungry, selective, disoriented, physical enough to be cared for and observed. Over time, the children remained in the village. The boy, according to the story, became sickly and did not survive for long. But the girl lived, and as she gradually adjusted to life among the villagers, her skin slowly lost its green color. She learned English. She became able to describe where she believed she had come from. And that explanation is what pushed the story beyond mere oddity into enduring mystery. She said they came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a country where everything was green, where the light was dim like perpetual twilight, a place where there was no bright sun as the villagers knew it. She described it as another world, or at least a place separated so completely from ordinary life that it might as well have been one. According to her account, she and the boy had been tending animals, or wandering, depending on the version, when they heard a strange sound. A bell. They followed it, and somehow passed through, not by ship, not by road, not by any normal route. They simply crossed from one place into another and emerged in Woolpit. That explanation has fascinated people for centuries because it offers no stable category. Was it folklore, a religious allegory, a story shaped over time to explain children who were foreign, orphaned, or displaced? There are grounded theories. Some historians believe the children may have been Flemish immigrants. In the 12th century, England had seen waves of migration and unrest. A pair of foreign children, malnourished and disoriented, speaking an unfamiliar language, might well have seemed uncanny to villagers who had never encountered anyone like them. The green tint of their skin under this reading may not have been supernatural at all. It may have been the result of malnutrition, specifically chlorosis or some other deficiency, giving their skin an unusual tone that later storytelling exaggerated. The strange clothing could be explained. The language barrier could be explained. The broad beans, too, might simply have been the first food they recognized. This interpretation is sensible, grounded, and in many ways, persuasive. But like so many of these cases, it never quite closes the gap completely. Because even once the most dramatic elements are stripped away, the shape of the story remains unusual. Two children appear. No one knows where they came from. Their explanation sounds impossible. And what survives through history is not clarity, but unease. There is also the fact that medieval chroniclers chose to record the case at all. Writers like William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall did not treat the event as an ordinary village matter. They preserved it because it struck them as strange. as something outside the expected order of things. And that matters, because the green children of Woolpit are not remembered simply because their story is weird. They are remembered because the people closest to the event seemed unable to settle on a normal explanation. That is what binds this case to the others. Like Kaspar Hauser, these are young figures with no clear origin. Like the man from Taured, they arrive carrying a reality that no one around them can verify. They are present, seen, federal, examined. And yet, the truth of where they came from remains suspended between explanation and impossibility. Were they simply foreign children, filtered through the fears and imagination of a medieval village? Or were they something stranger, visitors from a hidden land, survivors of a place cut off from our own, children who crossed somehow from one reality into another? It sounds absurd when stated plainly, and yet that is exactly why the story endures. Because once again, history gives us a figure who enters the record fully formed, without a past anyone can confidently place. And once again, the mystery is not that they were seen. The mystery is that no explanation has ever felt complete enough to make them ordinary. For centuries, the green children of Woolpit have remained balanced between folklore and history, too physical to dismiss entirely, too strange to explain cleanly. And in that space, they continue to live, not just as a story about medieval England, but as another piece of a pattern in which people appear out of place, out of time, or out of any world we fully understand. He never seemed to age. That was the detail people remembered. Not first his name, not his title, not even the rumors that followed him from court to court across Europe. It was his face, the same face, seen years apart, sometimes decades apart, and somehow unchanged. By the time the Count of Saint-Germain entered the salons and palaces of 18th century Europe, he was already a mystery. No one seemed to know exactly where he had come from. He arrived fully formed, elegant, cultured, impossible to place. He moved easily among nobles, diplomats, and intellectuals. He spoke multiple languages fluently, played the violin, painted, discussed science, history, alchemy, and politics, as if he had touched all of them personally. And wherever he went, he seemed to know too much about courts, too much about kings, too much about old events, as if he had not merely studied them, but lived through them. He called himself the Count of Saint-Germain, but that was not a name anyone could confidently trace. No country claimed him cleanly. No family line was ever established beyond doubt. There were theories, of course. Some said he was the illegitimate son of a prince. Others claimed he was connected to old aristocratic houses in Portugal, Spain, or Transylvania. Some believed he was a spy, hiding behind charm and intellect. Others thought he was a confidence man, an extraordinarily gifted impostor who had mastered the art of appearing important. But none of those explanations ever settled the matter, because Saint-Germain was not simply a man with a mysterious background. He was a man who seemed to exist outside the normal limits of time. One of the strangest details repeated in account after account was his age, or rather, the absence of it. People who met him years apart often described him the same way: refined, smooth-faced, energetic, neither young nor old. A man who appeared to sit outside the natural process of decline. And Saint-Germain did very little to discourage these impressions. In fact, he seemed to enjoy them. He hinted at things without fully explaining them. He spoke of the past with unsettling intimacy. He implied knowledge of people and events from generations earlier. At times, he allowed others to wonder whether he had been present at moments no living man should have remembered firsthand. It was a perfect strategy, never a direct claim, never something easy to disprove, only suggestion, only atmosphere, only enough to leave people asking questions long after he had gone. That talent for controlled ambiguity made him unforgettable, but it also made him difficult to define. Was he a brilliant social manipulator, using myth to increase his own value? Or was there something genuinely anomalous about him? This was not some wild figure on the edge of society. Saint-Germain moved among the elite. He was welcomed into courts, trusted at times with delicate conversations. He interacted with figures close to power, including the court of Louis XV. And that alone tells us something important. Even if many of the rumors around him were exaggerated, he was real enough, convincing enough, and skilled enough to survive in spaces where fraud was not easily tolerated for long. He was also associated with things that made him seem even less ordinary. Alchemy, secret knowledge, unusual jewels, chemical experiments, claims of creating or improving dyes and materials. He was said to possess immense wealth, yet no one knew the true source of it. He seemed to give the impression that he needed very little from the world, because he had already acquired what others spent their lives chasing. And perhaps that was part of the effect. Saint-Germain did not present himself like a man trying to rise. He behaved like a man passing through, as if identity itself was something he wore lightly, as if titles, origins, and even time were useful only insofar as they helped him move through the world unnoticed, or half-noticed, leaving behind more speculation than certainty. Eventually, as with all men, reports emerged of his death. The most common date given is 1784. A convenient ending, a neat closing point. But the story did not stop there. Because after his reported death, sightings continued. Years later, people still claimed to have seen him there. Not someone like him. Not an imitator. Him, still elegant, still composed, still unchanged. Writers, occultists, and mystics in the centuries that followed elevated him even further. By then, Saint-Germain was no longer merely a historical eccentric. He had become something else. A symbol of immortality. A wanderer through time. A man who did not belong to one era because he seemed capable of moving through many. That is the version of Saint-Germain most people remember now. Not the diplomat, not the court figure, not the possible fraud, but the anomaly, the man who appears and reappears without visibly surrendering anything to time. And that is what makes him fit here. Not because every story told about him is true, but because, like the others, he leaves behind the same disturbance in the record. A figure who cannot be placed cleanly, a life that never settles into one explanation, a man who seems to move through history without obeying it in the usual way. Was he a master manipulator? A gifted social actor who understood exactly how to build a legend around himself? Possibly. Probably. But even that does not fully dissolve the fascination around him. Because once again, history gives us a person who feels misaligned with the world around him. Not absent from the record, but never fully contained by it. And once again, the question remains, who was the Count of Saint-Germain really? In a hidden pocket, a small piece of paper was found, tightly folded, neatly cut, easy to miss, and on it, just 2 words, Tamam Shud. It means ended or finished. A strange message to find on any man. Stranger still, on a man no one could identify. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, a body was discovered on Somerton Beach, near Adelaide, South Australia. He was lying against the seawall, well dressed, polished shoes, tie in place, suit pressed. At first glance, nothing about him suggested poverty, violence, or obvious collapse. He looked composed, almost staged, as if he had simply sat down and never stood up again. There were no signs of struggle, no visible wounds, no clear cause of death, and perhaps most unsettling of all, no one knew who he was. Police searched his pockets. They found cigarettes, a comb, a bus ticket, a train ticket, a packet of chewing gum. Normal things. The kind of ordinary items that should have helped reconstruct a normal life. But even from the beginning, parts of the case felt wrong. Labels had been removed from his clothing. Not some. All of them. His name was nowhere to be found. No wallet. No papers. No obvious identification. It was as if someone had taken care to erase the trail, while leaving the man himself behind. And yet even that was only the beginning, because months later, investigators discovered the hidden pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers. Inside was the small scrap of paper bearing the words, "Tamam shud." The phrase had been torn from the final page of a book. That book, a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, was eventually found after a man came forward, claiming one had been left in his car around the time of the death. Inside that book, the missing page had indeed been torn out, and in the back, investigators found something else. A phone number and a line of strange letters, scrawled in a way that looked like code. Not a sentence, not a note, not anything easily explained. Just a sequence of characters that seemed to promise meaning without ever giving it. The phone number led police to a woman living not far from Somerton Beach. A nurse. She denied knowing the dead man's identity, but according to those who saw her reaction when shown a plaster cast of his face, she appeared shaken, not mildly surprised. Shaken. And yet, no clean answer ever came from that connection. The code was never solved. The man was never identified. The cause of death remained uncertain. Poison was suspected, but no poison could be conclusively established. Natural causes were considered, but never satisfied the strangeness of the scene. And so the Somerton Man became something rare even among famous mysteries. Not just an unsolved death, but an unsolved identity. A real man, a real body, a real investigation. And still, no one could say with certainty who he had been. Over the years, theories multiplied. Some believed he was a spy. The timing helped fuel that idea. The late 1940s were thick with intelligence paranoia. The Cold War was beginning to harden. Codes, anonymous deaths, removed labels, unexplained movements. All of it seemed to fit the atmosphere. Others believed the answer was more personal. A love affair, a rejected relationship, a private tragedy that ended in deliberate self-destruction. There were theories of murder, of espionage, of poisoning by means too subtle to detect easily at the time. And there were always whispers around the woman linked to the phone number. What she knew, what she hid, what she refused to say. But just like the other cases, every explanation seemed to leave something behind, something unresolved, because even when one piece of the story looked promising, another part refused to fit. If he was a spy, where was the proof? If it was suicide, where was the mechanism? If it was a private tragedy, why remove every trace of his identity? And perhaps most importantly, why did he end up there? Why Somerton Beach? Why that posture? Why those clothes? Why the code? Why the hidden message, ended, finished, as if the case itself had been written to close before it could be understood? That is what makes the Somerton Man so powerful as a mystery. Not just that he died, not just that he was unknown, but that everything around him feels arranged in the shape of an answer, without ever becoming one. He is not like the man from Taured, who arrives with a place no one can verify. He is not like Kaspar Hauser, who appears with no reliable past. He is not like the Green Children, who seem to emerge from a world just beyond explanation. And yet, he belongs beside them. Because once again, history presents us with a real human being, fully present, physically undeniable, and still somehow impossible to place. A man with a body, a face, clothes, belongings, movements, and evidence, but no origin anyone could prove. He existed. That was never in doubt. But who he was, where he came from, why he died there, all of it slipped just beyond the reach of certainty. In recent years, modern forensic work and renewed investigation have pushed the case further than ever before. DNA analysis has reopened old possibilities. Some researchers now believe they may have come closer to identifying him than anyone before. A likely name has been proposed. Connections have been drawn. Family lines explored. And yet, even now, the Somerton Man has not fully surrendered his mystery. Because solving a name is not always the same as solving a life. And in a case like this, identity was never the only question. The real disturbance lies deeper. How does a man die in public and leave behind a trail so deliberate, so unusual, so incomplete, that decades later, the story still feels less like a closed case and more like a message no one has managed to read? That is why the Somerton Man endures. Not because he vanished, not because he never existed, but because he was there, plainly, physically, undeniably there, and history still could not account for him. And once again, the same question remains. Who was he, really? History is full of mysteries, lost cities, unsolved crimes, objects that should not exist. But these cases feel different because they are not simply mysteries about events. They are mysteries about people. People who appear and refuse to fit. A man who arrived with a passport from a country no one could find. A boy who emerged into the world with no clear past. Children who seem to come from a place beyond any known map. A man who moved through history as if time itself had failed to mark him. And another, found in plain sight, fully real, fully present, yet still beyond explanation. Individually, each case can be argued away, a misunderstanding, a fabrication, a political lie, a folk memory distorted by time, a dead man whose secrets were simply buried with him. But when they are placed side by side, something else begins to happen. Not proof, not certainty, a pattern. Because in each of these stories, the same disturbance appears. Someone enters the record. They are seen, described, documented, and yet the world around them cannot account for them cleanly. Their past is missing. Their origin is uncertain. Their identity never fully settles into place. And that is what lingers. Not just the strangeness of what happened, but the possibility that history, every so often, catches sight of someone it cannot properly explain. Maybe that is all this is. A collection of broken records, embellished stories, and human error. A reminder that history is not as neat as we want it to be. But maybe it is something else. Maybe some people do not arrive in the world the way they are supposed to. Maybe some lives pass through history at the wrong angle. Close enough to be seen, too strange to be understood. And that may be why these stories survive. Because invented stories usually fade. They lose their shape. They collapse under their own weight. But these do not. They return in different places, in different centuries, in different forms, always carrying the same quiet question. Who were they? Or perhaps more unsettling still, where did they really come from?